talks about, a lot of unification of the consent. So is there any roadmap, or what kind of a roadmap, if it's there, which is there for unified consent and retention view across the fragmented ministries? So how it's going to work, or across the different systems?
Yeah, good question again. I'll attempt to put together a roadmap, at least the way I see it. So our government data landscape has just accumulated over a few decades. A lot of digitization has happened, and each government organization has built its own systems, its own databases, own identity schemes, and its own retention practices, many of which are not documented even. So the result is a very sprawling, a heterogeneous environment with NIC portals running alongside state data centers. You have cloud deployments sitting next to legacy on-premise systems. There's no unified data lineage, et cetera, et cetera. So a single citizens' data may exist simultaneously across UIDI, Income Tax Department, ABA, Umang portals, all and various scheme databases. So the DPDP Act requires retention. You talked about retention only for as long as the stated purpose necessitates, followed by either erasure or anonymization. So that obligation is very difficult to achieve. And so an agency basically, for a roadmap, they have to answer two basic questions. Where does citizen data live across our systems? And what purpose does each data set serve? So if you look at, like Ayushman Bharat, the digital mission, they've attempted, they've created this ABA ID, which is giving citizens a unified health ID, which links records across hospitals, insurers, government health schemes, etc. It's sort of a prototype of what a unified citizen data view could look like. But the lessons we are learning so far and continuing to learn on this ABDM's rollout is, and that's applicable for DPDP, is that in 5 years, ABA has over 90 crore registered IDs, but the actual linkage of health records to these IDs is still very sparse because the upstream systems, which is your health, electronic medical records, state health portals, were not built to interoperate. So the identity layer has worked, but the data federation layer has not kept pace. So a unified consent and retention architecture for DPDP faces exactly this challenge, that building the governance layer on top of systems that were never designed to share data. So what can a possible roadmap look like? So I would put it in like 3 steps. So the first phase or step should be, I would call it as know what you have. So this may take anywhere from 3 months to 6 months, I believe, depending on the complexity of the data for a government organization. This is basically a diagnostic step, your data asset inventory, data discovery, what personal data exists, where it lives, what is the volume, what is the classification, etc. So this inventory must be classified against a DPDP aligned taxonomy. That is important. So categorize it as personal data, sensitive personal data, anonymized data, and maybe operational or non-personal data, right? Once you do that, then I think what then it needs to happen is, see, you have to be careful because if you misclassify sensitive personal data as operational data, you will land up into a compliance problem later. So each data asset must be mapped to its legal basis and statutory retention obligation. So the output of this will be basically your ROPA or a processing activity register, right? This is the foundational compliance. Phase 2 in the roadmap can be building this unified consent and retention platform. So the way I see it, ideally, a central consent registry would be ideal, where it records every consent event across government with the data principal ID, the purpose, timestamp, consent expiry, withdrawal status, etc. So it's more like a federated architecture, not a central database. So ministries retain their own consent records, but the CCR holds like a consent index. Now, this should be integrated with probably existing citizen identity infrastructure like Aadhaar, ABA, DigiLocker, etc., to create a consent dashboard. Again, the RBI account aggregator framework does some of this. That's probably the closest available template. Then second part of this, in this phase, I would say, is a retention policy engine. So this must be deployed, I would say, in an automated way. That's very important. This data reaching its retention horizon must be automatically flagged for deletion or routed to a legal hold queue pending clearance or something. Income tax department has done an excellent job. They have a very good data lifecycle management for returns data, for assessments, scrutiny cases, appeal records, largely automated increasingly, where the retention periods, there's no manual intervention or relying on an officer to remember when to do these things. So that's a good template, the income tax template to look at. So all of this is probably in a phase 2. I would say it may take anywhere from, say, month 6 to 12 or 6 to 18, depending on the complexity of the data. The third and final phase of this roadmap is probably the most difficult, that is governing inter-ministry data flows. I think this is where is the highest risk area for DPDP compliance, data that crosses ministry boundaries. So today, how does ministries and government organizations share data? They have MOUs, informal agreements, which rarely specify retention limits, security standards, etc. Every interdepartmental data flow must be governed by a formal data sharing agreement. I think that's critical, which sets what are the data categories, what are the permitted purposes, the retention limits, and so on and so forth. Ministry of Electronics and IT has a data sharing and accessibility policy in 2022. They came out with it. But that is meant more for open government data, not necessarily for personal data sharing, but it should still be looked at because that gives a lot of templates and all that stuff. But from that, this data sharing agreement must be formulated. So these are the 3 areas that I think that are very important, that will basically constitute the core of this roadmap. And I will put it this way, the roadmap will succeed if a citizen can open a single dashboard, can see every piece of data the government holds about them across every ministry, understand why it is held and for how long, and action a withdrawal in minutes rather than months. Now, this might sound a little utopian, but that is what the DPDP Act actually aspires to do, to get to that stage. And so the infrastructure has to be built for that.